What if I told you the barbarian hordes were actually running one of history's most sophisticated empires? The Mongols had a postal system faster than medieval Europe, religious tolerance centuries ahead of its time, and laws so strict that stealing a horse could get you executed. But beneath this veneer of order lay a world of brutality and hardship. From the icy steppes to the smoke-filled tents, life in the Mongol Empire was a constant test of endurance. Let's uncover the dark realities behind the legend. The Mongolian steppe stretches endlessly, an unforgiving expanse of open grasslands where the horizon seems to fold into itself. Summers are dry and stifling, the air shimmering with heat that rises relentlessly from the earth. In winter, however, temperatures plunge so far below freezing that the breath of a traveler feels like ice cutting to the lungs. Winds rake across these plains year-round, unhindered by trees or hills, stealing the warmth from every living thing. There's no dense forest to retreat into, no stone buildings to shelter you from the elements, just miles and miles of grassland under a vast, indifferent sky. For the people who called this land home, no part of life came easily. Water wasn't found in the flowing rivers of settled lands, but in scattered, unpredictable springs and streams. Food came from the herds they raised or whatever could be hunted. A single bad season could starve an entire family, and those who survived were left only to try again. Mongol communities were always on the move, chasing pockets of grazable land for their livestock. Horses, sheep, goats, and the occasional yak. These animals weren't just their livelihood, they were their entire way of life. Horses carried them, sheep fed them, goats clothed them. Life revolved around their survival, and when they faltered, so did the people. Children born into this environment learned early that survival depended on the right skills rather than just luck. By the time a Mongol child could walk, they were already mounted on horseback, learning to balance and guide the animal that would carry them into adulthood. The horse wasn't a pet, or even just a tool. It was an extension of the body, a lifeline across the barren steppe. For the Mongols, horsemanship was like breathing. You weren't just taught to ride, you were expected to practically live in the saddle. But riding was only the beginning. Just as soon as a child's legs were strong enough to grip a galloping horse, their hands were placed on a bow. The bows they started with were smaller, matched to their size, but every pull of the string built the strength and precision they'd need later in life. Hitting a target wasn't enough. A Mongol archer had to be effective from horseback, where the ground rushed past beneath their mount's hooves, and their foes often closed in fast. They didn't practice these skills for sport or as a pastime. They practiced because they had to. They practiced because their very survival demanded it. The skills they honed in childhood weren't separate from their daily lives. Herding flocks was a training exercise in disguise, teaching children to navigate terrain efficiently and react quickly to emergencies like predators attacking their livestock. Hunting for food taught them patience and perfect aim, skills vital not just for feeding themselves, but for the battlefield. And while the elders of the community shared their knowledge, they didn't coddle the young. There wasn't any room to. Life on the steppe made everyone, even children, face its harsh realities head-on. Now, it might seem like an impossible way to grow up, balancing survival with constant, rigorous preparation for an unknown future. But the Mongols were practical people, built by their environment. The skills taught to their children weren't abstract or ceremonial. They were essential, deeply ingrained abilities that shaped them into either farmers or hunters, or, more importantly, warriors. Because on the steppe, the line between a hunter's aim and a soldier's strike was razor thin, and crossing it often wasn't a choice. What made it especially grueling wasn't just the physical duress, but the reality that failure meant devastating consequences. Without the ability to ride or shoot proficiently, survival became nearly impossible. Even a skilled herdsman risked watching his family starve during harsh winters if he slipped up for even a season. Avoiding these fates required relentless discipline and constant practice, and these habits stayed with them into adulthood. A person who couldn't adapt, whether to the land or to the demands of this lifestyle, didn't survive long enough for excuses to matter. The steppe demanded self-reliance, but also required tight bonds of community. If a rider fell ill or if wolves claimed a herd, families had to rely on each other to recover and endure. The same idea extended to their military later. Survival wasn't just a personal goal, it was a group effort. These early lessons in communal reliance taught the Mongols to trust their tribes implicitly, a trait that eventually played a crucial role in why their armies were so cohesive. But what truly set this upbringing apart is how deeply it informed the Mongols' future as conquerors. While children in settled societies learned to read, count, and recite poetry, Mongol children prepared for war without even knowing it. They didn't study tactics in books or train in organized schools of combat. Instead, every arrow shot at a deer and every race across the open grasslands was contributing to their transformation into some of history's most effective warriors. Take the skill of riding, for instance. Most cavalry forces of the time were formed of soldiers trained as adults, under strict orders. Mongols, however, grew up riding, practicing maneuvers naturally throughout their lives, until they could control their mounts in ways other riders couldn't even imitate. A Mongol warrior riding at full speed not only controlled their horse with precision, but could also turn and shoot from almost any angle, all while staying nearly impossible to hit. This wasn't learned in a practice field. It was second nature, a lifelong bond with the horse beneath them. Then there was the bow, arguably the deadliest tool in their arsenal. Their early childhood practice with scaled-down bows wasn't just tradition. It was the first step in mastering the composite bow they'd carry into battle as adults. Mastery took years and started early, because the weapon was deceptively demanding. Crafting the bow itself was no small feat, requiring layers of wood, sinew, and bone glued together in painstaking precision. But wielding it was even more challenging. Pulling a bowstring with enough force to send an arrow hundreds of meters wasn't something anyone could do without years of conditioning and practice. By the time a Mongol child reached adolescence, they had already spent most of their life conditioning their bodies for this very task. Their training ensured they could fire rapidly and effectively, not as individuals separate from their communities, but in coordination with the greater horde. What started as practical lessons in survival evolved into the foundation of a military force unmatched in its time. But forging such warriors came at a steep personal cost. Childhoods were tough, often joyless in the ways we think of today. There were few, if any, luxuries. No large ceremonies marking the passing years, no long stretches of carefree play. Their games were their training, and their training was their life. Yet, this upbringing created more than just hardy individuals. It forged one of history's most formidable peoples, whose endurance and adaptability would eventually change the course of entire continents. Surviving the steppe was never about luck or chance. It was a brutal, ongoing test of every skill, decision, and resource a person could muster. By the time a Mongol stepped onto a battlefield as an adult, they had already survived trials of equal, if not greater intensity in the open wilds. The bitter winters and blistering summers, the wolves that roamed the plains, and the scarcity of food had prepared them for every hardship imaginable. And yet, learning to survive the elements was just the beginning. Surviving nature might toughen the body, but surviving conflict would test them in entirely new ways. Life on the steppe required discipline and adaptability, but these qualities came to define more than just their survival. They became the foundation of an empire. The next challenge, though, lay not in their upbringing, but in the tools they would come to wield, like their bow. How did a relatively simple weapon allow the Mongols to dominate battlefields that stretched from Europe to Asia? The answer lies in the craftsmanship, precision, and deadly practicality of the composite bow. While other civilizations wielded swords, spears, and metal shields, the Mongols perfected a weapon that was compact yet powerful, lightweight yet devastating. Unlike larger, more unwieldy longbows used by European armies, the Mongol bow was designed to suit a nomadic lifestyle and the demands of warfare fought on horseback. It was a tool of survival, molded by the realities of the steppe, and it became a tool of conquest. So, what made the composite bow different? At its core, it was a marvel of engineering, especially given the limited tools and resources of the time. The bow was constructed from a combination of materials that each served a distinct purpose. Its core was wood, chosen for its structure and resilience. The back of the bow, the part that faced away from the archer, was layered with animal sinew. This provided the bow with flexibility, allowing it to bend under heavy tension without snapping. The belly of the bow, which faced the archer, was made of horn, typically from animals like ibex or water buffalo, which added strength and maximized the bow's ability to store energy. These materials were bound together using strong animal glue, and in many cases, a layer of birch bark was added to protect the exterior from harsh conditions. This multi-layered construction wasn't just for durability. It enabled the bow to store an immense amount of energy relative to its size. When drawn and released, this stored energy powered the arrow forward at astonishing speeds, giving it both accuracy and destructive force. Remarkably compact, these bows were shorter than the longbows seen in other parts of the world, a design that allowed a mounted warrior to wield them with ease without being encumbered. The Mongol bow was efficient in every sense, an ideal match for the fast, mobile warfare that characterized the Mongol conquests. However, building a composite bow was anything but simple. Craftsmen required years of experience and great patience to perfect their technique. Each bow took months to complete, as the materials had to be carefully processed and assembled. The sinew and horn needed to be softened and molded, and the animal glue had to have just the right consistency to hold everything together. During construction, the bow underwent repeated bending and testing to ensure it wouldn't fracture during use. The final product was not only functional, but almost artistic in its level of detail, a tool to be both respected and feared. Of course, even the best crafted bow was nothing without the skill to wield it. For the Mongols, mastery of the bow began in childhood. As young riders spent hours in the saddle, they were also learning to shoot with precision, using smaller versions of the composite bow as their muscles and coordination developed. Unlike the controlled conditions of archery ranges in sedentary societies, Mongol archers practiced in real-world scenarios, pursuing game, shooting from irregular terrain, and targeting moving objects from horseback. This kind of practice didn't just teach them how to aim. It conditioned their bodies for the immense physical strength required to draw a composite bow. These weren't tools for casual use. Drawing one to its full extent took years of training, as it demanded both technique and sheer endurance. The Mongol composite bow's power wasn't just in its construction, but in its versatility on the battlefield. Mongol warriors carried multiple bows into combat, often slinging a smaller, faster-drawing bow for close-range use alongside a larger, heavier bow for long-range strikes. And then there were the arrows, each designed to suit a specific purpose. Armor-piercing arrows with hardened steel tips would slice through the defenses of even the most heavily equipped soldiers. Other arrows, lighter in build, were optimized for unarmored targets, allowing the archer to fire rapidly without sacrificing lethal force. Some arrows were crafted to produce a whistling noise when they flew, a psychological weapon designed to unnerve enemies by filling the air with eerie, high-pitched sounds. This arsenal of arrows gave Mongol warriors the ability to adapt swiftly to different foes and terrains, ensuring they could maintain the upper hand. In battle, these weapons turned individual fighters into a coordinated force of destruction. A single Mongol archer could fire multiple arrows per minute, but a formation of them could unleash volleys so dense they blocked out the sun. This wasn't firing at random, though. The Mongols were known for their precision and timing. As their enemies tried to organize ranks or charge forward, the Mongols would strike first, sending wave after wave of arrows to disrupt formations and cause confusion. But unlike traditional armies of infantry or cavalry, which would charge after an initial volley, the Mongols didn't need to get close to deliver damage. Their bows allowed them to maintain distance, raining destruction while staying mobile enough to avoid counterattacks. The psychological impact of Mongol archery was often as devastating as the physical toll. Imagine standing in rigid armor, watching as a swarm of nimble riders appeared on the horizon, too far for your weapons to reach. Then the arrows came, silent at first, until the air erupted with a rain of death. The chaos that followed wasn't accidental. It was part of the Mongol strategy. Those whistle-equipped arrows weren't meant to kill, but to demoralize. The constant barrage, paired with the eerie sounds, would sap morale, making even the most disciplined soldiers question whether it was worth holding their line. Mastering the bow was inseparable from mastering the horse. A Mongol warrior wasn't just an archer, they were a horse archer, trained to move and shoot as one seamless unit. They could control their mounts with their knees, leaving their hands free to notch and fire arrows, even while galloping at full speed. They could pivot in their saddles, aiming behind them while their horse surged forward, or fire to the side without breaking stride. These maneuvers weren't just displays of skill, they were practical tactics that allowed them to engage enemies from every angle, avoiding hand-to-hand combat while inflicting enormous casualties. The combination of bow and horse created an unbeatable synergy. Enemy forces found themselves chasing ghosts, always outmaneuvered and unable to return effective strikes. Heavy infantry and knights, accustomed to slower, close-range engagements, were especially vulnerable. The Mongols' lightweight cavalry and their relentless rain of arrows made traditional charges look like relics of an outdated method of warfare. Historical accounts illustrate the destruction these tactics caused. In many battles, entire armies were shattered before they could even draw swords. The Mongols' ability to destroy their foes from a distance not only secured victory, but often broke the will to resist entirely. In some cases, word of their tactics alone was enough to make cities surrender without a fight, as leaders tried to avoid the utter carnage they knew would follow resistance. The bow wasn't merely a weapon for killing, it was a tool for conquest, designed to subdue entire populations. But for the warriors themselves, maintaining such a weapon required constant attention. The composite bow's construction made it vulnerable to moisture, which could weaken the sinew and degrade the glue holding it together. Warriors had to keep their bows carefully wrapped when not in use, often in cases made of leather or birch bark. Maintaining their arrows was another task, ensuring they were sharpened, balanced, and ready for battle at a moment's notice. Neglecting these duties could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. Ultimately, the Mongol composite bow was more than just a piece of technology. It was a reflection of the Mongols' way of life. Practical, adaptable, and supremely efficient. Where other armies relied on brute strength or sheer numbers, the Mongols relied on precision and discipline. Their bows allowed them to conquer across climates and defenses, making them as effective in the frozen plains of Russia as they were in the deserts of Persia. But if their bows were devastating tools of conquest, it was how the Mongols organized themselves that made their war machine unstoppable. Behind the chaos of the battlefield lay a meticulously structured system, one that made their armies function with precision and ensured loyalty even in the heat of war. Commanding an army of tens of thousands across the steppes, deserts, and forests of Eurasia might sound like the perfect recipe for chaos. Yet, the Mongols achieved this with efficiency that armies of their time, and even long after, struggled to match. The secret wasn't just their discipline, it was their revolutionary organizational method, the decimal system. This system divided their forces into structured units, creating an iron framework of control and accountability that transformed hordes of mounted warriors into a precise war machine. At its heart, the decimal system was simple but incredibly effective. Soldiers were grouped in tens, with these squads called an arban. 10 arbans formed a zoot of 100 men. 10 zoots formed a mayangat of 1,000, and 10 mayangats made a tumen of 10,000. Each unit had a designated leader, chosen not by noble birth, but by merit, strength, skill, and the respect earned among fellow soldiers. This pyramid-like structure allowed orders to flow seamlessly from the highest commanders to the smallest squads, and information could be reported upward just as effectively. It also meant that even the largest armies could operate as coherent, disciplined forces, with every individual fitting into a clear and functional chain of command. This wasn't organization for organization's sake. Every level of the system had its purpose, and every soldier had a role to play. Within smaller units, the leaders directly oversaw not only the tactical effectiveness of their men, but also their morale, supplies, and welfare. Issues like food shortages, improper equipment, or a soldier's inability to perform were the responsibility of the leader at hand, which kept problems manageable and minimized inefficiencies. If an arban of 10 struggled due to poor leadership, the consequences wouldn't ripple unchecked through larger units. They would stop at the source. This system of delegation ensured that even armies numbering in the tens of thousands could adapt quickly, react to changing battlefield conditions, and sustain themselves far from home. More than just a chain of command, the decimal system fostered collective responsibility. Accountability wasn't limited to individual actions. It extended to the entire unit. Every soldier was bound to the group's survival and success, and the consequences for failure were often severe. If one man deserted, the rest of the arban could face harsh punishments that ranged from physical penalties to outright execution. Similarly, an entire zoot, or even a myangat, might be punished if their leader failed to follow orders or showed cowardice. This shared responsibility bred extraordinary vigilance. Soldiers would ensure not only their own loyalty and discipline, but also that of their comrades. The cost of failure, or treachery, was too high for anything less. Such harsh measures may seem extreme, but they were key to the Mongols' cohesion. Discipline wasn't optional. It was a cornerstone of their effectiveness. With lives often hanging in the balance, this form of enforced unity strengthened their ability to act as a single entity, regardless of the conditions. Unlike the armies of more fragmented states, where personal ambition, disputes, or lack of clear authority could sow confusion, Mongol units followed orders with precision. Loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Knowing that every success could bring reward, while every failure brought swift retribution, kept soldiers sharply focused. This structure didn't just create discipline, it turned the Mongol army into a logistical marvel. Supply chains, resource management, and even battle strategies benefited from this methodical organization. A tumen of 10,000 strong still functioned internally as smaller self-sufficient groups, so food and supplies could be distributed effectively without descending into chaos. Supplies didn't have to be delivered to every individual. They could be provided to each layer of the system, which would then pass them along. Leaders at every level could monitor the gaps in provisions and ensure no unit was left without what they needed to keep going. This efficiency allowed the Mongols to fight long campaigns deep into foreign territories, where resupplying from distant homelands would have been otherwise impossible. On the battlefield, the real strength of the decimal system became clear. Mongol commanders could organize their forces with startling precision. A tumen could split into smaller groups to encircle the enemy, or remain whole to deliver a concentrated blow. Arbans and Zoots allowed for flexible tactics, deploying units to flank, ambush, or harass enemies without losing coordination. Smaller units could also act independently if necessary, allowing for hit-and-run attacks that confused and weakened their opponents. With shared responsibility and dedicated leadership at every level, units didn't wait idly for orders. Each leader had the autonomy to take action within the scope of the overall plan. The system also helped mitigate the challenges of the vast distances the Mongols often faced during campaigns. When forces stretched across sprawling front lines, the decentralized nature of the decimal system allowed smaller groups to function under broad orders without needing constant communication from the top. This flexibility granted them the ability to fight on multiple fronts or converge suddenly, overwhelming enemies who had underestimated their coordination. Strong leadership was integral to this method working as intended. Nomadic traditions played a significant role here, as Mongols had long valued leaders who proved themselves in action rather than inheriting authority. Experience, bravery, and the respect of the men mattered more than titles or birthright. Those who couldn't inspire confidence or failed to uphold their responsibilities could quickly lose their positions or their lives. Because leaders were judged by their effectiveness, this emphasized mutual trust between commanders and their men. While soldiers feared the consequences of failure, they also knew that their leaders shared in their risks and responsibilities. The values behind the decimal system, discipline, accountability, and adaptability, rippled throughout Mongol society as well. Leaders who rose through its ranks didn't just earn the right to command on the battlefield. Many went on to hold administrative or political roles in the empire. The military system laid the foundation for how the Mongols governed, blending strict hierarchy with an emphasis on individual competence. The same order that defined their armies extended to their sprawling empire, where efficiency and clear lines of responsibility unified a wide range of cultures and territories. Despite its benefits, the system demanded an extraordinary level of commitment. For a Mongol soldier, individuality had to be set aside in favor of group success. Decisions to desert or disobey weren't just personal choices, they were betrayals of the entire unit. This sense of duty went beyond survival to become a fundamental part of what it meant to serve in the Mongol military. Combined with the promise of rich rewards for loyalty, it created a fighting force motivated by both fear of failure and hope for success. The results spoke for themselves. The Mongol armies could mobilize faster, adapt better, and strike harder than their enemies. Their campaigns were unstoppable, not only because of brute force, but because of how seamlessly they functioned. Even in the face of larger or more technologically advanced foes, their superior organization gave them an edge. Every soldier understood their role, every leader knew their responsibilities, and no commander at the top was left wondering whether orders would be carried out. As impressive as the decimal system was, it couldn't solve every problem the Mongols faced. Communication across their vast campaigns remained a challenge, especially when split forces moved hundreds of miles apart. To maintain their efficiency and unity over such distances, they turned to something just as sophisticated as their military organization, a communication network that was years ahead of its time, stretching across the vast expanse of land under Mongol control. The YAM system was a communications network unlike anything the world had seen before. At its core, it was a system of relay stations, spaced strategically across the empire, each stocked with fresh horses and ready messengers. Messages could be passed from one rider to the next, or carried between relay points with remarkable speed. This allowed information to flow uninterrupted, crossing thousands of miles faster than any pre-modern system of the time. For the Mongols, who ruled a sprawling empire that often seemed to stretch as far as the imagination, the YAM became their vital artery, the lifeline that kept their governance and campaigns synced, even over impossible distances. The brilliance of the YAM system wasn't just in its concept, but its scale. At each relay station, a rider would either pass off the message to a fresh courier or switch to a waiting horse. The stations themselves were like checkpoints across the landscape, ensuring that riders never carried messages for too long or rode horses to exhaustion. Covering the Empire's enormous footprint required hundreds of these outposts, all meticulously managed and maintained. What this meant in practice was that an order issued in the Mongol capital could potentially reach an army deep in enemy territory in a matter of days, not weeks or months, as it would have in many other states at the time. This speed was far from trivial. In a world where military campaigns often hinged on timing, the Mongols had an undeniable edge. The YAM system allowed generals to react swiftly to changing battlefield conditions, while distant armies could adjust their movements based on fresh intelligence. It wasn't uncommon for an army hundreds of miles from its nearest commander to receive updated orders before an enemy even knew they'd been outmaneuvered. Governance benefited just as much. An empire as vast and diverse as the Mongols required constant oversight, and the YAM ensured that those in power could stay informed about distant uprisings, tax collections, or trade developments. The riders themselves were as vital to the YAM system as the infrastructure supporting it. These couriers weren't just efficient, they were relentless. Riding through dangerous and unpredictable terrain, they faced everything from rugged mountains to scorching deserts to open plains. Travel offered almost no comfort. Rest was limited, food was basic, and the constant risk of bandits or enemy forces was ever present. For the Mongol Empire, speed outweighed personal safety. Messages carried by the YAM couriers didn't pause for weather or nightfall. They were urgent by design. Riders had to push onward in nearly all conditions, knowing delays could mean more than just inconvenience. In times of war, a single misstep in communication could cost an entire campaign. The horses were an equally crucial part of the system. Mongol ponies were famous for their endurance and hardiness, traits developed over millennia on the harsh steppe. They could travel long distances with minimal food or water, enduring grueling conditions where other horses might falter. But even the toughest mounts had their limits, and that's where the YAM's relay stations became critical. At each station, fresh horses waited, allowing couriers to transfer to a rested mount while their previous horse recovered. This system conserved equine energy and ensured continuous momentum, with hardly a moment's pause between one rider leaving and another arriving. The efficiency of this network was extraordinary for its time. Historical records suggest that messages could travel as far as 300 miles in a single day, a staggering feat compared to other communication systems of the era. By comparison, Civilizations that relied on foot messengers or slower horse relays lagged far behind, often taking weeks to deliver important news across distances that the Yam could handle in days. For the Mongols, this wasn't just a matter of convenience. This speed allowed them to enforce centralized control across an empire so large it stretched from East Asia to Eastern Europe. Orders, policies, and military strategies could be communicated with a precision and speed unmatched by their contemporaries.
But maintaining this sprawling system required immense resources and coordination.
Relay stations weren't just waypoints. They were hubs stocked with all the essentials. From fresh horses to supplies for riders, each station had to be fully prepared to handle constant traffic, regardless of the time of year. Local populations were often tasked with supporting these stations, a responsibility that came with its own burdens. Villagers might be required to provide horses, food, or other resources needed to ensure the system functioned smoothly. This intense level of organization reflected how deeply the Mongols valued communication. They were willing to invest heavily in the Yam because the returns it offered, in terms of military and administrative control, were immense. For traders, the Yam system wasn't just a tool for the Mongol military. It became a crucial element in facilitating commerce across the empire. Merchants trading along the Silk Road benefited from the network's ability to carry messages regarding market conditions, trade deals, and supply movements. This rapid flow of information gave commerce a level of organization and efficiency previously unseen. It also helped integrate the diverse economies of the empire, making it safer and more profitable for traders to move goods across vast distances. And while the system primarily served the military and government, it inadvertently fostered cultural exchange as well. The Mongol Empire became a melting pot of ideas, technologies, and beliefs, all of which traveled through the same relay stations that carried orders and intelligence. Still, the Yam system had its limits. Riders endured grueling tolls on their bodies, with little room for error. Besides rider fatigue, one could imagine the logistical burden of continuously maintaining stations, horses, and supplies across such a vast territory. Given the unpredictable nature of warfare, uprisings, and natural disasters, disruptions to the system were inevitable. Nevertheless, the Mongols excelled at adapting to challenges as they arose. The resilience of the Yam system was a testament to this adaptability, ensuring that even amidst chaos, the lines of communication remained functional. The Mongols' approach to communication was as methodical as their approach to warfare, and the Yam played a foundational role in their ability to control such an enormous empire. The system wasn't just fast, it was reliable. Leaders relied on it for both day-to-day administration and the high-stakes demands of empire building. This network turned what could have been an unmanageably large territory into something impressively unified. Whether it was coordinating a multi-front invasion or simply staying informed about distant provinces, the Yam ensured that no corner of the empire was isolated. In many ways, the Yam system acted as an invisible thread stitching the empire together. It allowed disparate places, cultures, and armies to remain connected under Mongol rule. For those outside the empire, its speed and reach were nothing short of intimidating. How could you compete with an empire whose military and government moved faster than you could prepare your defenses or form alliances? The psychological impact of this efficiency was almost as powerful as its practical effects. To enemies, it seemed as if the Mongols could communicate and act with an omnipresence that bordered on the supernatural. But for the Mongols themselves, the Yam wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a reflection of their priorities. Speed, precision, and cohesion defined both their military tactics and their governance. The system enabled them to outmaneuver rivals politically and militarily, giving them the agility they needed to dominate such a diverse and widespread realm. It was emblematic of their empire, practical at its core, but grand in its ambition. Still, the Yam was just one layer of Mongol dominance. While it kept their empire running smoothly and ensured rapid responses to any challenge, it was ultimately a tool of control, not conquest. What truly made the Mongols feared far beyond their borders wasn't just their speed of communication. It was their ability to wield terror as a weapon, making resistance feel not just futile, but fatal. Once their messages had reached the edge of the empire, it was often fear that carried their reputation even further. The Mongols didn't just rely on their weapons or swift horses to win battles. They perfected a strategy that often made fighting unnecessary. Psychological warfare was one of their most effective tools, and they wielded it with such precision that entire cities and armies surrendered without a single arrow being fired. By spreading fear before their arrival, they created an aura of inevitability. Resistance wasn't just discouraged, it was portrayed as a horrifying mistake. One of the ways the Mongols achieved this was through their calculated use of survivors. After an attack, they would rarely leave a battlefield completely abandoned. A handful of people were deliberately spared, not out of mercy, but to carry a dreadful message back to their communities. These survivors would recount tales of overwhelming force, brutal massacres, and the utter destruction left in the Mongols' wake. The psychological impact of these stories was often worse than any physical battle. The chosen survivors weren't just messengers, they were living proof that resisting the Mongols brought devastation without fail. Over time, word-of-mouth accounts of their brutality traveled faster than the Mongol armies themselves, demoralizing entire regions before the first riders even appeared on the horizon. The Mongols also understood that fear could be amplified through spectacle. When they sacked cities, they didn't hide the devastation behind closed gates. Whole towns would be destroyed, and those who resisted were often killed en masse. The resulting scenes, fields filled with bodies, structures reduced to smoldering ruins, weren't solely the byproduct of war, but an intentional message. These massacres were carefully staged displays, meant to serve as warnings to anyone still thinking about defiance. Their use of violence wasn't random or unrestrained. It was targeted to maximize its psychological impact. By leaving behind stark evidence of the cost of resistance, they ensured that news of their ruthlessness would spread quickly and with vivid detail. Their tactics even extended to the way their forces moved. The Mongols were known to attack swiftly, overwhelming their targets with speed and efficiency. They would strike one place and then vanish as quickly as they had arrived, only to reappear hundreds of miles away, seemingly without warning. This created the illusion of omnipresence, an unnerving sense that the Mongols could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. This unpredictability broke down morale among their enemies, as no one could predict where they might strike next or how to prepare for what was to come. But fear alone wasn't enough. The Mongols paired it with careful manipulation and strategic offers of surrender. When facing a fortified city or a determined army, they frequently gave their opponents a choice: surrender and be spared, or resist and face annihilation. Their reputation for total destruction made these ultimatums highly effective. Many cities opened their gates without a fight, desperate to avoid the fate that they believed awaited them otherwise. This approach allowed the Mongols to conserve both time and resources. Instead of depleting their forces in prolonged sieges or bloody battles, they simply let fear do the heavy lifting. One historical example that underscores this is their approach to sieges. The Mongols were experts in siege warfare, but they often used the mere threat of their capabilities to secure victory. They employed captured engineers to demonstrate their siege equipment and readiness for battle, leaving no doubt that they could breach even the mightiest walls. However, seizing cities by force was a last resort. Their enemies, faced with tales of earlier Mongol campaigns and the visible power of their technology, often surrendered long before a single shot was fired. This strategy turned their reputation into its own kind of battering ram, breaking down defenses without ever needing to deploy their full military strength. A critical factor in the success of the Mongols' psychological warfare was their intelligence gathering. Before attacking, they studied their enemies closely, identifying weaknesses and pre-existing fears. This knowledge allowed them to tailor their tactics to specific targets, hitting not just physical vulnerabilities, but also emotional and cultural ones. For instance, they would exploit divisions within an enemy's ranks, spreading rumors or targeting key leaders to weaken internal cohesion. They also disrupted supply lines and communications, making enemies feel increasingly isolated and vulnerable. These efforts compounded the psychological toll, ensuring that resistance seemed not just futile, but hopeless from the start. In some cases, the Mongols compounded the fear they created by using deception to inflate their numbers. Before an attack, they might set up dummy camps with extra tents or light exaggerated numbers of fires to make their forces appear larger than they were. This gave the impression that their army was too massive to resist, further demoralizing opponents who were already frightened by their reputation. This combination of illusion and carefully planted fear was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, making even small armies seem invincible. Even the Mongols' choice of targets reflected their understanding of fear as a weapon. They prioritized major population centers or prominent strongholds, knowing that the destruction of such places would echo across entire regions. These victories were as much about spreading their reputation as they were about securing strategic gains. It was a chain reaction. One fallen city would serve as a warning to the next, ensuring that the fear traveled faster than their horses. In this way, the Mongols conquered not just with their swords and bows, but with a calculated campaign of psychological dominance. Their strategies didn't just terrify soldiers and rulers. They created anxiety among entire populations. Farmers abandoned their fields, leaving regions starved and economically drained. Refugees fled ahead of Mongol armies, bringing chaos to surrounding areas and further undermining the stability of potential resistance efforts. This constant state of fear made organizing any coordinated defense almost impossible. Even rulers who might have been inclined to resist often found themselves paralyzed by pervasive panic among their subjects. Despite its brutality, the Mongols' use of terror had a cold logic to it. They didn't engage in senseless slaughter. Their actions were intentional and goal-oriented. The decision to destroy a city wasn't made out of anger or revenge, but as a calculated measure to ensure future compliance from surrounding areas. By contrast, those who complied with Mongol demands were often integrated into the empire with relative leniency. This stark contrast further reinforced the effectiveness of their psychological strategies. Submission meant survival, while defiance meant obliteration. One of the most enduring effects of the Mongols' psychological warfare was the aura of invincibility it created. Their enemies came to see them as an unstoppable force of nature, not just an army of men. This perception was reinforced by their efficient use of the YAM system, which allowed them to respond with alarming speed to rebellions or threats, even in distant regions of their empire. The combination of their rapid mobilization and fearsome reputation made the Mongols appear superhuman, as though resistance was not just dangerous but outright impossible. Over time, the legends of Mongol brutality took on a life of their own, sometimes stretching the truth, but always serving the Mongols' purposes. In regions they hadn't even reached, rulers fortified their cities in preparation, fearful of an invasion that might never come. This alone speaks to the far-reaching power of their psychological tactics. The Mongols had not only mastered warfare, but had also weaponized fear itself, ensuring that their enemies often defeated themselves before an actual confrontation ever took place. Terror wasn't just one tool in the Mongols' kit. It was foundational to their strategy. By breaking the will of their enemies before swords clashed, they secured faster, more efficient victories, ensuring their conquests stretched farther and lasted longer. It was a chillingly effective method that paired perfectly with their disciplined armies. But the same brutal logic that allowed them to inspire fear on the battlefield also extended to their own ranks. Within the Mongol war machine, discipline was absolute, and defiance was met with consequences just as severe as those inflicted on their enemies. For the soldiers who fought beneath the banners of the Khans, loyalty wasn't an ideal. It was enforced with ruthless precision.
What does it take to keep an army of hundreds of thousands in perfect order, ready to respond to commands without hesitation? For the Mongols, it wasn't just training or strategy. It was a code of discipline,
enforced by punishments so severe they left no room for disobedience. Loyalty was not a matter of pride or preference. It was mandatory. Their rules were absolute, and breaking them often meant death, sometimes not just for the offender, but for those closest to them as well. The result was an army that ran with unmatched precision, functioning as a single, unstoppable force. Discipline in the Mongol military wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with an iron grip. The rules were clear, and the consequences for breaking them were equally undeniable. At the heart of this system was a culture of fear that kept soldiers tightly bound to their duties. Desertion, disobedience, or cowardice in battle was not something the Mongols tolerated. Those found guilty of such offenses could expect swift and public executions. These punishments weren't carried out in hidden corners. They were deliberately visible, a stark reminder to every soldier of what awaited them if they even considered stepping out of line. By making examples of offenders in this way, the Mongols strengthened discipline not just within a single unit, but across the entire army. The Mongols didn't stop at individual punishment. They also employed collective penalties that added an even heavier layer of accountability. If one soldier deserted his post or failed in his duties, it wasn't just he who suffered the consequences. His entire arban, the squad of 10 he belonged to, could be punished alongside him. In some cases, this could even extend to the soldier's family, who might also face execution for his offenses. Imagine knowing that one mistake, one lapse in judgment, could mean the death of not only yourself, but everyone you cared about. It bred a level of commitment that was absolute. There was no room for hesitation, no space for rebellion. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. For the Mongols, it was a necessity. Their armies often operated far from home, deep in hostile territory, where any disruption in cohesion could lead to disaster. They couldn't afford hesitation, and they certainly couldn't tolerate dissent. Each soldier needed to be part of a larger machine, one that operated without friction or delay. In enforcing this kind of discipline, the Mongols ensured that their armies could face virtually any challenge without breaking apart under the strain. Orders were followed because the cost of disobedience was simply unthinkable. One of the most severe examples of this discipline came in how the Mongols handled acts of betrayal. Loyalty to the Khan and to one's comrades was considered sacred, and violating that trust was among the gravest sins. Soldiers who betrayed their oath, either by abandoning their unit or by collaborating with the enemy, faced not just execution, but often the eradication of their legacy. Families of traitors were killed alongside them, cutting off their bloodline entirely. This wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. By making betrayal so unthinkably costly, the Mongols ensured that loyalty wasn't just expected, it was the only feasible option for survival. Beyond the battlefield, this strict enforcement of loyalty extended to all aspects of military life. Every soldier, from the lowest ranks to the highest commanders, was expected to adhere to a code of conduct that governed everything from daily behavior to decisions in combat. Violating the code, even in less obvious ways, could carry severe penalties. For example, looting without permission during a campaign was strictly forbidden. Soldiers might be surrounded by riches in newly conquered lands, but taking so much as a handful of goods outside the official order could result in immediate punishment. This kind of restraint was unusual for armies of the time, many of whom treated looting as just another natural part of war. But the Mongols recognized that discipline and cohesion mattered more than temporary spoils. Their focus remained on the larger goal, conquest, not chaos.
This rigid discipline wasn't just about maintaining order. It also gave the Mongols a distinct advantage over their enemies. Many of the forces they faced were plagued by infighting, lack of direction, or poor leadership. In contrast, the Mongol army moved as if controlled by a single mind.
When orders were issued, they were followed instantly and without question. A soldier didn't pause to weigh the risks or debate the morality of an action. They simply acted, knowing that hesitation could cost them more than just their position. This unity of purpose allowed the Mongols to execute complex battlefield maneuvers that other armies couldn't hope to replicate. The survival of the Mongol Empire depended on this unity. In a vast empire stretching across diverse cultures, landscapes, and climates, maintaining control required constant vigilance. Rebellions had to be crushed swiftly, and troops had to remain ready at all times to mobilize wherever they were needed most. The Mongol leaders relied on their strict code of discipline to make sure no cracks appeared in the foundation of their military. Without it, holding their conquest together would likely have been impossible. The distances were simply too great, and the burdens of empire too demanding. This discipline was further reinforced by the Mongols' leadership structure. Commanders weren't just chosen for their political allegiance or family connections. They earned their roles through proven ability and respect among their troops. This meritocratic approach meant that soldiers trusted their leaders and were more likely to follow orders without resentment or resistance. A commander who led by example, fought alongside his troops, and shared in the hardships of military life, didn't just demand loyalty, he inspired it. This mutual respect played a critical role in ensuring that discipline remained effective across all levels of the army. What made a Mongol soldier willing to endure endless marches, freezing nights, and the ever-present threat of death? The answer wasn't just fear of punishment, it was the promise of reward. The Mongol military wasn't powered by discipline alone. It was driven by a system of incentives that made every man invested in the empire's success. Chief among these were the spoils of war. From gold and livestock to human captives and conquered lands, each victory brought tangible rewards, ones that directly benefited the soldiers who earned them. For the Mongols, fighting wasn't just about survival or loyalty to their leaders. It was about making personal gains that could transform their lives. When the Mongols conquered a city, the wealth of that conquest didn't vanish into the coffers of a distant ruler. It was shared. Plunder was divided with a clear and organized system, ensuring that every soldier received a portion of the riches seized in battle. Gold, silver, jewels, fine textiles, anything of value could serve as a reward. High-ranking officers received larger shares, but even the lowliest warrior could expect a piece of the spoil. This system wasn't an act of generosity. It was a calculated strategy. By intertwining the soldiers' fortunes with the success of the Mongol war machine, leaders guaranteed that each man had a stake in sustaining the empire's conquests. Yet, plunder wasn't limited to treasures. Livestock, horses, sheep, camels, goats, often formed the bulk of a soldier's rewards. For a nomadic people like the Mongols, these animals weren't just wealth, they were survival. They provided food, transportation, and a way to sustain families back on the steppe. Conquering larger and richer lands meant integrating greater numbers of animals into the Mongol herds, which strengthened not only individual soldiers but also the broader economy of the empire. A soldier rewarded with livestock didn't just gain in the moment. They secured resources that could support their households for generations. It's important to note, however, that fear and punishment weren't the only tools the Mongols used to maintain order. They understood that punishment alone wasn't enough to motivate men to endure the brutal hardships of campaign life. Alongside the strict enforcement of discipline came rewards for loyalty and success. Soldiers who proved themselves courageous or effective in battle could earn promotions, land, or shares of plunder. This balance of reward and punishment made the system not just effective, but sustainable. Soldiers remained motivated because there was always the promise of personal gain, so long as they continued to obey. Yet, rewards alone wouldn't have been enough to hold the Mongol army together, without the severe consequences that awaited failure. The punishment served as a constant reminder that discipline was non-negotiable. By pairing these two approaches, the Mongols created a military culture that was both feared and envied by their enemies. It's easy to see why, centuries later, their armies are still regarded as one of the most disciplined forces in history. The effectiveness of this approach wasn't limited to the battlefield. It defined their empire as a whole. Just as soldiers followed orders without question, the vast territories under Mongol control were expected to submit to the will of the Khans. The same culture of discipline that united their armies also unified the sprawling empire. It was a system that demanded control but also offered a clear path to success for those who embraced it. The Mongols took order to its extreme, demanding complete obedience and ensuring loyalty with consequences so severe that defiance became unthinkable. For them, discipline was not just a military strategy, it was a survival mechanism. It allowed them to control vast territories and coordinate massive armies with incredible efficiency. But discipline alone wasn't enough to inspire loyalty. The promise of wealth and reward for those who remained obedient revealed the other side of their system, one that balanced fear with a reason to remain committed. While their iron discipline held their forces together, it was the possibility of reward that kept the gears of their unstoppable war machine turning. What made a Mongol soldier willing to endure endless marches, freezing nights, and the ever-present threat of death? The answer wasn't just fear of punishment, it was the promise of reward. The Mongol military wasn't powered by discipline alone. It was driven by a system of incentives that made every man invested in the empire's success. Chief among these were the spoils of war. From gold and livestock to human captives and conquered lands, each victory brought tangible rewards, ones that directly benefited the soldiers who earned them. For the Mongols, fighting wasn't just about survival or loyalty to their leaders. It was about making personal gains that could transform their lives. When the Mongols conquered a city, the wealth of that conquest didn't vanish into the coffers of a distant ruler. It was shared. Plunder was divided with a clear and organized system, ensuring that every soldier received a portion of the riches seized in battle. Gold, silver, jewels, fine textiles, anything of value could serve as a reward. High-ranking officers received larger shares, but even the lowliest warrior could expect a piece of the spoil. This system wasn't an act of generosity. It was a calculated strategy. By intertwining the soldiers' fortunes with the success of the Mongol war machine, leaders guaranteed that each man had a stake in sustaining the empire's conquests. Yet, plunder wasn't limited to treasures. Livestock, horses, sheep, camels, goats, often formed the bulk of a soldier's rewards. For a nomadic people like the Mongols, these animals weren't just wealth, they were survival. They provided food, transportation, and a way to sustain families back on the steppe. Conquering larger and richer lands meant integrating greater numbers of animals into the Mongol herds, which strengthened not only individual soldiers but also the broader economy of the empire. A soldier rewarded with livestock didn't just gain in the moment. They secured resources that could support their households for generations. Conquered lands brought rewards of an entirely different scale. When the Mongols took control of foreign territories, this land didn't always remain in the hands of its original rulers. Instead, much of it was redistributed among Mongol warriors, especially those who had proven themselves in battle. Some were granted estates, where they could either settle or oversee the local populations. For a people accustomed to the open plains of the steppe, the ownership of fertile farmland must have felt like unimaginable wealth. Soldiers who had once roamed as herders now found themselves as landowners, with peasants working under their authority, a completely new kind of power and status. The Mongols also distributed captives as spoils, which served a dual purpose. Captives could be used as laborers, bringing extra hands to manage herds, farms, or even personal households. For officers and those who received larger shares of captives, This could translate into extra wealth if they chose to trade or sell their prisoners. While these captives were undeniably a grim part of the reward system, their inclusion further strengthened the personal stake each soldier had in conquest. Men marched not just for survival, but with the knowledge that the next city they stormed might mean gaining the workers, land, or riches that could elevate them and their families. The promise of rewards also created a kind of fierce competition within the ranks. Soldiers had a direct incentive to perform well, follow orders, and distinguish themselves in battle. That incentive wasn't abstract. It was simple and material. A soldier who fought harder, led better, or succeeded in capturing prized loot could return home with clear proof of his success. This naturally fostered an ambitious and competitive culture within the Mongol army. The same soldiers who shared the burdens of harsh campaigns knew they were vying against each other for a chance at glory and material gain, which, in turn, strengthened the discipline and cohesion of their units. This culture of reward wasn't only about doling out immediate plunder. Leaders such as Genghis Khan recognized that loyalty didn't just need to be commanded, it needed to feel worthwhile. The spoils of war allowed soldiers to envision a better future, not just for themselves, but for their descendants. Victorious campaigns didn't just bring food to the table, they built legacies. Warriors who earned land or wealth could ensure their families enjoyed higher status and stability, creating a deeply personal reason to fight harder and remain committed to the empire's growth. The way plunder was distributed further ensured fairness and order across the army. Distribution wasn't chaotic or left to the whims of individual leaders. The Mongols organized their rewards with the same precision they applied to their campaigns. After a city was sacked, the loot wasn't immediately claimed by whoever reached it first. Soldiers didn't scramble for valuables in a free-for-all. Instead, the plunder was gathered and recorded, and its division was overseen by commanders, who ensured that each soldier received their earned portion. This method prevented infighting and maintained trust in leadership. A soldier's faith in their superiors wasn't just about survival. It was reinforced by seeing the system work in their favor. Fairness in reward distribution also played a significant role in preventing rebellion or dissent within the ranks. Whether they were ordinary warriors or high-ranking officers, men knew their efforts in battle would be recognized and rewarded appropriately. A soldier charging into enemy territory could trust that the system in place wasn't tilted unfairly against him. It created a sense of unity, rooted as much in mutual benefit as it was in loyalty to the Khan. Dissent rarely had space to grow among armies motivated by the goal of shared gain. The scale of these rewards grew as the Mongol Empire expanded. Each year of conquest pulled more territories, livestock, and wealth into the fold, further incentivizing soldiers to stay the course. It wasn't just the immediate spoils that drove the Mongol engine forward. Soldiers understood that every campaign brought new opportunities. With each new victory came the promise of new riches, new lands, and new captives. This sense of endless opportunity helped maintain morale and kept soldiers pushing forward, even during the most grueling campaigns. After all, there was always another city to conquer, another fortune to claim. However, the rewards weren't handed out indiscriminately. The Khan and his commanders understood the importance of balancing short-term incentives with long-term stability. Not everyone could keep large estates or manage sizable treasures. Some land and resources were set apart for the empire itself or redistributed strategically to maintain control over local populations. The Mongols also used rewards as a tool for creating alliances. Some conquered leaders or nobility were allowed to retain their lands in exchange for loyalty, and in doing so, The Mongols reinforced the empire's political strength, while still ensuring their soldiers were rewarded appropriately. This organized and clearly defined reward system extended beyond individual battles. It became a cornerstone of Mongol governance. Conquered lands weren't integrated randomly, but through an organized structure that allowed resources to flow efficiently into the empire's control. Warriors invested in these lands didn't merely take from them. They became part of managing and defending them. In this way, the Mongols' military success fed directly into their ability to govern such vast territories. A carefully balanced system of rewards turned conquerors into administrators, ensuring territories were stabilized after victory and that the empire itself didn't fragment under the weight of its own success. This steady flow of material gains also fueled the Mongol army's expansion further. Victories paved the way for more campaigns, and the wealth of one conquest helped fund the next. By tying soldiers' personal fortunes to the empire's success, the Mongols created a virtually self-sustaining cycle. Soldiers fought not only out of obligation, but because their livelihoods and legacies depended on continued conquest. While other armies might stall after extended campaigns due to lack of funding or conscript fatigue, the Mongols kept moving because the rewards outweighed the risks. The effectiveness of this reward system cannot be overstated. It was more than a promise of material wealth. It was the framework that sustained one of history's most aggressive and successful expansions. The Mongols' emphasis on shared spoils didn't just keep their armies fed and motivated. It inspired a level of commitment and determination that is rarely seen in the history of warfare. Every soldier had a reason to fight, and every victory brought with it a tangible reminder of what loyalty to the empire could achieve. The rewards also reflected the Mongols' fundamental understanding that dominance required cooperation among all levels of society, from the lowest warrior to the leaders at the very top. Wealth and power weren't simply hoarded by a select few. They were distributed strategically, strengthening the entire system. It was a reminder that their astonishing efficiency and success on the battlefield were matched by practical, methodical governance off it. As the empire grew, this balance of reward and discipline proved invaluable. But the soldiers who carried the empire forward didn't just fight for plunder. They lived a life of constant hardship and endurance. And for many, their daily realities as cogs in the Mongol war machine were far from the glory that came with conquest. Life for the average Mongol soldier on campaign was anything but glorious. It was defined by a relentless routine of hardship that shaped them into a force capable of sustaining conquests over vast and unfamiliar lands. Whether marching across barren deserts, freezing tundras, or dense forests, these soldiers endured conditions that would break almost anyone else. Yet this was life for them, one built around mobility, endurance, and a constant state of preparedness. A Mongol soldier carried everything they needed to survive on their own, reducing dependence on complex supply lines. The essentials included dried meat, thin strips of cured protein that lasted for weeks, sometimes months, without spoiling. These were practical for their efficiency, but they made for a monotonous diet. Soldiers supplemented this with whatever they could find along the way, whether that meant foraging edible plants or seizing livestock during raids. Their strict self-sufficiency allowed them to move quickly and remain operational even when isolated from supply centers. It wasn't luxury. It was survival stripped to its most basic form, a reflection of the same resourcefulness that had been ingrained in them since childhood on the steppe. Beyond food, a soldier's kit included their weapons, spare bows, arrows, tools for maintenance, and clothes for extreme weather. With temperatures on the steppe swinging from searing heat in the day to freezing cold at night, their gear needed to be adaptable. They packed felt blankets for insulation, coats made of fur or heavy wool, and special riding boots, designed for long hours in the saddle. Their bows, which needed careful upkeep to remain functional despite the climate's extremes, were always protected in leather cases, ready to be used at a moment's notice. Almost everything carried by a soldier served a dual purpose. No single piece of equipment could weigh them down unnecessarily in a life built on speed and practicality. Life on campaign also came with constant movement. Long marches defined the days, often stretching for hours or even days without rest. Horses were rotated frequently to prevent exhaustion, with each soldier typically managing several mounts. These animals weren't treated as expendable tools. The soldiers relied on them completely. A worn-out horse could mean falling behind, and falling behind wasn't an option in an army defined by relentless momentum. Rest, when it came, wasn't luxurious either. Soldiers slept under the stars, or in simple tents they erected quickly. Even when resting, their ears stayed attuned to any sign of danger. The sense of vulnerability heightened their alertness and kept them constantly ready for action. The physical hardships were matched by the strict communal structure of Mongol military life. Soldiers rarely, if ever, had privacy. They ate together, worked together, and camped together. Meals, though meager, were shared communally, reinforcing unity among the men. A typical meal might consist of boiled meat or fermented dairy products, depending on what was available. If they were far from familiar territory, they'd improvise by making use of local resources, often relying on what they seized from conquered lands. Resources were pooled, and while this fostered a sense of camaraderie, it also meant that personal space simply didn't exist. Each man's life became inseparable from the lives of those around him. This closeness wasn't optional. It was a deliberate part of the Mongol system. A soldier relied on the 10 men in his arban as much as he relied on his own skills. Each group of 10 operated almost like a family, sharing not just food and resources, but responsibility. If one man failed in his duties, the consequences could ripple through the entire group. This accountability wasn't merely a psychological tool, it was a survival mechanism. On the battlefield, every arban needed to function as a perfectly coordinated unit. During long campaigns, they depended on one another to manage shared tasks, like setting up camp or scouting for potential threats. Trust wasn't just important, it was fundamental. Despite the communal nature of their lives, the pace of campaigning left little time for bonding beyond what was necessary. Soldiers spent most of their waking hours preparing for combat, monitoring their surroundings, and ensuring their equipment was in working condition. Maintaining their bows required special care. A bow left exposed to too much moisture or heat could lose its effectiveness. Arrows needed to be sharpened, balanced, and replenished regularly. Even their horses demanded constant attention. A sick or injured mount required swift care to avoid jeopardizing the entire group's mobility. These daily routines were grueling, but they weren't negotiable. Neglecting any element of preparation could mean death, either from enemy forces or the unforgiving conditions of the lands they moved through. On top of the physical demands, Mongol soldiers lived with the psychological pressures of constant vigilance. For them, the battlefield wasn't just a place they marched to, it was everywhere. Ambushes could happen at any time, whether during a raid or while simply resting for the night. Soldiers trained to stay alert to every sound, every unusual movement on the horizon. This heightened awareness, combined with the experience of near-perpetual movement, created a sense that danger was always present. This vigilance wasn't voluntary. It was necessary in an unpredictable and hostile world. Yet, even as they lived in what seemed to be a constant state of fatigue and readiness, Mongol soldiers adapted to this lifestyle in ways that most armies of the time couldn't. Their upbringing on the steppe had prepared them for a life of extremes. Since childhood, they had ridden for hours on end, coping with the harsh cycles of nature while mastering the skills of herding and hunting. For most of these soldiers, the daily grind of military life wasn't entirely unfamiliar. It was like an amplified version of the lives they already knew. What made them different was how they sustained themselves in conditions that would have left others paralyzed or broken. Mongol camps reflected this balance between grueling hardship and remarkable coordination. These weren't scattered, disorganized arrangements, but carefully planned setups that allowed for both rest and rapid mobilization. The camps often formed concentric rings, with layers of security protecting the core where commanders rested. Even in camp, nobody relaxed entirely. Guards were posted at all hours, and orders could come at any moment to pack up and move. A soldier needed to be ready to leave in minutes, even if it meant abandoning an unfinished meal or collapsing tent. This level of readiness wasn't just a habit. It was drilled into them as part of the larger Mongol discipline. Despite these hardships, there were moments when soldiers reaped the rewards of their conquests. After a successful siege or battle, the spoils of war provided temporary relief, rich food, alcohol, and the kind of luxuries they would rarely see otherwise. These brief glimpses of indulgence were a stark contrast to the otherwise austere life of a warrior. But they were temporary distractions. The pace of Mongol campaigns left little room for indulgence to sink in. Victories were followed quickly by new orders, new marches, and new targets. Even as they enjoyed these moments of triumph, soldiers knew the next challenge was never far away. The relentlessness of this lifestyle forged soldiers who were extraordinarily resilient. From their diet of dried meat to their grueling marches, every aspect of life on campaign prepared them for conquest. They carried their lives on their backs, slept under the open sky, and trusted their survival to the men beside them. This constant pressure sharpened their focus and stripped away unnecessary distractions, leaving only what was essential. It created a kind of warrior that could endure, soldiers who didn't just survive harsh conditions, but thrived in them. Yet this life wasn't without its cost. While their discipline and adaptability made them formidable, the physical and mental toll of constant campaigns was immense. Many soldiers never saw their families again once they left for war. Horses, comrades, and conquests became their entire world, replacing the homes and herds they had once fought to protect. For every moment of glory, there were weeks, sometimes months, of exhaustion and uncertainty. The sacrifices they made as individuals were enormous, all subsumed into the larger machinery of the empire. In a sense, a Mongol soldier's life wasn't really their own. They were cogs in one of history's most relentless and ambitious war machines, living lives of brutal efficiency with little room for sentimentality. Their victories reshaped the world, but the human toll, both on the conquered and the conquerors themselves, was staggering. What they gained in wealth and legacy, they often paid for with years of hardship, relationships lost to war, and the constant grip of uncertainty. Their resilience made the Mongol Empire a force like no other, but it also came with a question. Was the price of their success ever truly worth it? Was the Mongol Empire's overwhelming success truly worth the immense suffering it brought to those who lived through its conquests? From the chaos and destruction of cities to the millions of lives uprooted or ended altogether, the human cost of their campaigns was staggering. Behind every military victory or infrastructural achievement, there was hardship on an unimaginable scale, a harsh price paid by those who found themselves in the path of the Mongol war machine. One of the clearest measures of this cost comes from the sheer number of lives lost. While exact figures are debated by historians, the casualties inflicted during the Mongol conquests likely numbered in the millions. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, populations decimated, and survivors uprooted from their homes, left to wander or live under oppressive new rule. One of the most infamous examples is the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Baghdad was not just a city. It was a cultural and intellectual capital, home to libraries, scholars, and an essential part of the Islamic Golden Age. Yet when the Mongols arrived, its fate was sealed. They razed the city, killing massive numbers of its inhabitants and destroying priceless manuscripts and resources housed in its great libraries. In one swift campaign, centuries of learning and culture were lost, swept away in service of military conquest. Baghdad wasn't unique. This same pattern repeated across many cities. Samarkand, Nishapur, Kiev, and countless other urban centers suffered similar fates. For those living within the Mongols' expanding shadow, survival often came at the cost of abandoning their homes, their livelihoods, and sometimes their very culture. Farmers and rural communities were not spared either. Villages were destroyed, crops were trampled, and irrigation systems were obliterated. These were deliberate tactics, designed to weaken opponents and ensure compliant populations. However, this destruction permanently altered the social and economic landscapes of entire regions. Displaced populations faced famine, and the knock-on effects of agriculture and economic collapse continued long after the Mongol armies had moved on. Beyond the immediate toll of destruction, the Mongols brought a unique paradox to the regions under their control. Their conquests created opportunities for trade and cultural enrichment. But these gains came at extraordinary costs. They expanded the Silk Road, ensuring safer passage for merchants and encouraging the exchange of ideas, goods, and technologies. This achievement, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, gave rise to a level of interconnectedness that spanned from China to Europe. It's impossible to deny how transformative this was, but it's equally impossible to ignore the cost behind it. This flourishing trade was built on the backs of the defeated. Cities had to submit entirely. Populations were pushed into forced labor, and social cohesion in conquered areas was strained to the breaking point. By expanding commerce, and at the same time uprooting lives, the Mongol Empire became both a bridge for progress and a hammer of oppression. Perhaps what makes the Mongol legacy so complex is this dual nature. Their strategies were ruthless, but they were also terrifyingly efficient. Psychological warfare wasn't just a military tool. It was a harsh reality for those who lived under the threat of Mongol dominance. Tactics like mass executions and deliberate displays of violence were as much about sending a message as they were about securing control. In some cases, severed heads of the defeated were piled high at the gates of cities as a grim signal for others to submit or share the same fate. These calculated acts of terror demoralized populations and made resistance feel futile. Yet, the horrifying effectiveness of these tactics also meant fewer battles fought. Some cities surrendered outright, opting to avoid the massacre and destruction they believed was inevitable. The physical destruction of infrastructure compounded the suffering. The Mongols excelled in dismantling irrigation networks in regions dependent on agriculture, crippling food production for years or even decades. Their occupation turned fertile lands into barren wastelands, with no immediate path to recovery. Survivors of such campaigns often found themselves not only mourning their dead, but also struggling to rebuild their communities in the absence of functioning systems. This pattern of targeting infrastructure for destruction left lasting scars on the lands they conquered. Economies faltered. Populations shrank under the weight of poverty, starvation, and disease. For some regions, these impacts lingered far beyond the Mongols' reign, fundamentally altering their trajectory for centuries. Ironically, while the Mongols were responsible for vast cultural destruction, they also facilitated cultural exchange. Through the movement of merchants, scholars, and adventurers across their empire, ideas flowed in every direction. Technologies improved, medical knowledge expanded, and artistic traditions mingled. But this convergence of cultures, while undeniably significant, often masked the cultural devastation left behind. Libraries burned, religious practices were suppressed, and many forms of artistic expression were lost forever. In the destroyed cities, thriving traditions were replaced by stark homogeneity. Territories that had once been culturally distinct became cogs in the broader Mongol system, losing pieces of their identity in the process. The displacement of populations added another heavy layer to the human cost. The Mongols relocated entire communities, forcibly moving skilled workers, artisans, and farmers to different parts of the empire to serve strategic needs. While some of these individuals found opportunities in new towns or courts, the trauma of being torn from homes and kinship networks was inescapable. It wasn't just individuals who were displaced. It was entire cultures, scattered and fragmented, sometimes never to fully recover. This reshuffling of demographics had far-reaching consequences, often destabilizing previously thriving regions. Even after the height of the Mongol conquests, the toll on human life continued. The empire's extensive trade networks played a role in the spread of the Black Death, one of history's deadliest pandemics. The same routes that carried silk, spices, and scientific ideas also carried disease. While the Mongols weren't the sole cause of the plague's spread, the movement of people, goods, and armies under their watch contributed to its westward expansion. The outbreak decimated populations across Eurasia, further altering the social and economic fabric of the world they had conquered. For many, it was the final blow in a series of cascading catastrophes, set in motion by Mongol expansion. The Mongol system of governance also imposed severe burdens on conquered populations. Heavy taxation drained resources, while forced labor conscripted individuals into massive public works projects or military campaigns. Compliance wasn't optional. Some regions did experience relative peace and stability under Mongol rule, particularly those that submitted quickly and aligned with their conquerors. But for others, oppression under Mongol authorities exacerbated the already dire conditions created by war and displacement. People who had once lived under organized and familiar systems of governance were now subject to the whims of a foreign empire, which often taxed them heavily and left local leaders powerless. Despite all this, historians remain conflicted on the Mongols' long-term legacy. At their height, they reshaped the known world, linking regions that had previously been disconnected and laying the foundation for cultural and economic exchanges that would ripple through history. Yet, the foundation of everything they accomplished was soaked in blood. Their ability to govern such a vast empire was undeniably impressive, but it came at a profound human cost that cannot and should not be overlooked. One cannot fully reckon with the Mongol Empire's history without asking uncomfortable questions. Were the advances in trade and the spread of knowledge worth the displacement, death, and destruction visited upon millions of people? Can the creation of a vast empire be admired without acknowledging the unimaginable brutality that sustained it? The answers aren't simple, and perhaps they were never meant to be. The Mongols' legacy, like their empire, stretches across vast contrasts. The human cost of conquest wasn't just measured in lives lost. It echoed in the cultures erased, the cities burned, the traditions dismantled, and the enduring scars left on the lands they touched. The same roads that carried progress and prosperity carried stories of grief and suffering. The resilience of human civilization allowed conquered populations to rebuild and adapt, but what was lost can never fully be recovered. The story of the Mongol Empire is one of extraordinary achievement, but it's impossible to celebrate their accomplishments without confronting the staggering toll paid by those whose lives they changed forever. Even now, the legacy of the Mongols remains as vast and complex as the empire they built. For every tale of prosperity through trade, there is a corresponding account of a city burned to the ground. For every instance of cultural exchange, there is a record of traditions obliterated. Their history stands as both a testament to human ingenuity and a sobering reminder of the destruction that can come from unchecked power. These echoes of conquest remind us that history, like empires, is rarely simple. The Mongol Empire remains one of history's most striking examples of brilliance born from brutality. Their unmatched organization forged an empire that connected East and West, creating pathways for trade and cultural exchange through the Silk Road. Yet, for the millions who lived and died under their ambitions, this progress came at an unfathomable cost. Surviving as part of their war machine required resilience we can hardly imagine today, in a world of modern ease. Their story forces reflection on history's lessons, that the achievements of empire often stand on painful foundations. Perhaps it's enough to study their legacy, rather than live it.